Welcome to today's webinar. On behalf of the National Transit Institute, I welcome you and thank everyone for joining us this Thursday afternoon. The National Transit Institute develops, promotes, and delivers training and education programs for the public transit industry in the United States. Today's webinar is NTD Data Reporting Fundamentals for All Reporters. And we are very pleased to have as our presenters today, Kyle Fritz and Dan Barnes. Kyle Fritz joined the NTD program in 2011 and currently serves as a senior validation analyst. He has a Bachelor's of Science in Financial Information and Analysis from Clarkson University. Dan Barnes joined the NTD team in 2012. He is also a graduate of Clarkson University and currently works as a senior validation analyst for the Urban Reporting module of the National Transit Database. Today's session should run about an hour, and that's kind of that's the cutoff. So because we expect the presentation to pretty much take the entire 60 minutes, we ask that you put your questions in the Q&A box as you have them at any time during the presentation. If you don't see your Q&A box, you can enable it by making the little window menu bar come up at the bottom of your Zoom, and there's a box for Q&A, which is different from the chat box. The chat box, oh, Dan is correcting me. I'm sorry, 90 minutes. I apologize. I thought this, oh, right, we went over that. So sorry, let me back up. We have 90 minutes, so there's still a lot of info to cover. And if we have time at the end, we could do some live Q&A, but we're still asking you to put them in the Q&A box. Sorry, my bad. Where was I? Oh, so the chat box is also something you can make pop up, and you can chat to the panelists alone or all the other attendees. If you put your question in there, I will try to find you and my colleague Slandria, who I will promote to panelist shortly, and we'll ask you or remind you to put that in the Q&A box. I'm rambling now because I got distracted by the time situation. Anyway, if you find that you want a copy of the questions and the answers that are typed into the Q&A box, because on Tuesday's webinar, there were a lot of people who did want that, I will provide a link to that with the survey email that everyone will get later this afternoon or tomorrow morning. So you have to open the email, might as well take the survey, and then you can get your link to the Q&A box. I think that's all the housekeeping items. Sorry again for rambling. I am now going to shut up and turn the presentation over to Kyle.
Thanks, Lori. Good afternoon, and welcome to the webinar for NTD Data Reporting Fundamentals. Before we begin, here is the content information for the NTD Program Help Desk. If you have questions after the conclusion of today's webinar, you can contact the NTD Help Desk for any NTD reporting questions. If you have any issues that relate specifically to your agency, we ask that you contact your assigned NTD analyst directly to ensure the best possible response. The NTD Help Desk is staffed Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. through 7 p.m. Eastern Time. As Lori mentioned, my name is Kyle Fritz, and along with Daniel Barnes, we will be your presenters for today. Our contact information is here in case you want to reach us after the presentation. In this presentation, we will be discussing an overview of the National Transit Database, key concepts to understand before reporting, how to start the NTD report, clarifying different transit modes. We will go over the annual reporting forms. We will review the monthly and safety and security reporting forms, and then we'll conclude with a Q&A session. We'll begin by going over some background information on the NTD program. The National Transit Database was established by Congress in 1974 to be the nation's primary source of information and statistics on the U.S. transportation systems. Data collected by the NTD is used to apportion roughly $9 to $12 billion each year to transit agencies. It's used to assist FTA in reporting on the state of public transportation, serve as a base for public transportation service planning, assist in making public sector investment decisions, and a source of data for measurement and benchmarking and formulating a national policy on public transit. The NTD serves as a central repository for standardized public transit data across America. Data users who wish to understand a focal topic, agency, geographic region, or time period related to public transportation can reference the data collected and published by the NTD. This data is particularly reliable source of study American transportation systems, as the data is verified and published by the U.S. federal government. Some agencies are required by federal mandate to file an annual report. Congress requires agencies to report the NTD if they receive or benefit from FTA Section 5307 or 5311 formula grants. These are government grant programs that disperse monetary assistance to public transit operators. If an agency receives either or both of these funds from FTA, they are on the hook to report with no exception. You must also report to the NTD if you are an operator of public transportation and have assets still within their useful life that were funded with Chapter 53 funds. Some agencies do not receive 5307 or 5311 funds, but wish to submit their data to the NTD on a voluntary basis. Agencies are welcome to file an NTD report voluntarily. Doing so allows agencies to be included for consideration in the annual funding formula. This also allows their data to be included in the annual database publications with other public transit agencies. Agencies who report voluntarily must conform to the normal NTD reporting requirements and meet the same deadlines as if they were required to report. We will now go over what the National Transit Database considers public transportation. Public transportation as defined by NTD constitutes regular, continuing, shared ride surface transportation services that are open to the general public or open to a segment of the general public defined by age, disability, or low income. This does not include intercity passenger rail, intercity bus, charter bus, school bus, sightseeing, or courtesy shuttle service for patrons of one or more specific establishments, or intra-terminal or inter-terminal shuttle services, or taxi voucher programs. Here is an example of what an agency may run into during the year. A private party reserves a transit vehicle as part of a charter service for a special event. The bus operates that day from noon to 8 p.m. and then returns back to the lot. The transit agency must not report the data associated with this service to the NTD, as charter services are not regular and continuing. Here we have an example of another possible scenario. A transit agency contracts a ride-hailing service to provide on-demand service to its paratransit riders. Riders receive a limited number of subsidized on-demand rides per month. Customers are not guaranteed an exclusive ride. As of right now, this service may be eligible as public transit, but for NTD reporting, we would need more information. The following conditions would have to be met in order to be considered public transportation and reportable to the NTD. The agency would have to be paying the full cost of service, less the fares. Drivers and passengers cannot refuse additional passengers if there's available seating capacity. And the service operator must attempt to group all rides to facilitate shared ride service. Now let's briefly go over each of the different modes of service. Motor bus is a transit mode using rubber-tired passenger vehicles operating on fixed routes and schedules over roadways. Vehicles are powered by a motor with the fuel or electricity stored on board the vehicle. Transit agencies must report any route-deviated or point-deviated service as motor bus. This is what most people report as their general bus service. Trolley bus is a fixed route service that uses manually steered rubber-tired vehicles powered by electric current from overhead wires using trolley poles. Please note that rubber-tired replica trolleys or historic trolleys powered by an onboard motor are not included in this mode. These would most likely be considered regular motor bus service. Bus rapid transit is a transit mode that operates over 50% of its route in a separate right-of-way dedicated for public transportation use during peak periods and includes features that emulate rail service, such as the following: defined stations, traffic signal priority for public transportation vehicles, short headways with bidirectional services for substantial parts of the weekday and weekend days, and applies a separate and consistent brand identity to stations and vehicles. Commuter bus is a local fixed route bus transportation mode that primarily connects outlying areas with a central city or urbanized area and operates predominantly in one direction during peak periods. This mode has limited stops and operates at least 5 miles of continuous closed-door service. Commuter rail is an electric or diesel-propelled railway for urban passenger train service consisting of local travel that operates between a central city and outlying areas. This must be operated on a regular basis by and under the contract with a transit operator for transporting passengers within urbanized areas or between urbanized areas and outlying areas. Commuter rail is generally characterized by multiple trip tickets, specific station-to-station fares, railroad employee practices, relatively long distances between stops, and only 1 or 2 stations in the central business district. Heavy rail is an electric railway that operates service in exclusive right-of-way. The service is often provided by long trains of 6 to 8 cars or more that travel relatively short distances between stops within a city and the immediate suburbs. These are the typical subway services found in many major American cities. Light rail is an electric railway that operates in mixed traffic or intersects with roadways at grade crossings. These are shorter trains that travel short distances within a city and the immediate suburbs. These are powered from overhead electric lines via a trolley or pantograph. Streetcar rail are typically 1 or 2 car trains powered by overhead catenaries that operate in mixed traffic and make frequent stops. Ferry boat is a mode with vessels carrying passengers over a body of water. These vessels may carry other vehicles, but intercity ferry boat service would not be reportable. Demand response is a transit mode operating on roadways in response to requests from passengers or their agents to the transit operator. They are typically scheduled in response to passenger calls, and then vehicles are dispatched to provide the rides. Passengers with similar origins and destinations are grouped together when possible. Demand response does not operate over a fixed route or a fixed schedule unless temporarily satisfying a special transit need. It is much more commonly operated to meet ADA requirements. We'll be discussing the different types of demand response services when we talk about the different types of service in a couple of slides. Van pools operate a ride-sharing arrangement providing transportation to a prearranged group of individuals. To be considered public transportation, van pool programs must use vehicles that with a minimum seating capacity of 7 people, including the driver. They must use vehicles which 80% of the yearly mileage comes from commuting. They must be open to the public. They must be actively engaged in advertising the van pool service to the public and in matching interested members of the public to vans with available seats. And they have to be publicly sponsored. Other modes of transportation we recognize but are less common are aerial tramways, Alaska Railroad, cable car, inclined plane, monorail, and Publico. If you are interested in details about these modes, please take a look at the NTD policy manual or contact your validation analyst. There are 4 types of service, which can be paired with the aforementioned modes: directly operated, purchase transportation networks, purchase transportation taxi, and general purchase transportation. The directly generated type of service is simply when the service is performed by the transit agency. In these instances, The agency uses their own employees to operate the vehicles. Purchase transportation are transportation services provided to the public transit agency or government unit from a public or private transportation provider based on a written contract. Agencies will typically buy service from a local contractor to operate service on behalf of their transit agency. If the purchase transportation service is dispatched using a mobile application and uses non-dedicated vehicles, the service should be considered a transportation network company with type of service designation of TN. If you believe your service fits this definition, you should reach out to your validation analyst for more information. If the purchase transportation service is provided by taxi cab companies, then the service would be designated the taxi, TX, type of service. All other purchase transportation services which don't meet the definitions of transportation network companies or taxis should be reported as general PT. These services can use both dedicated and non-dedicated vehicles. We will now go over the basics necessary to understand how to report to the NTD reporting system. If you are required to report to the National Transit Database or want to voluntarily and do not yet have an NTD ID, you will need to go to transit.dot.gov and complete an ID request. FTA will review the request and either approve, deny, or request more information. Within the request are pertinent data that determines your reporting type, reporting deadline, and who we should reach out to with questions. Now I would like to discuss some of the main NTD user roles and what privileges they have in the system. The NTD contact can edit, save, and submit all data and requests. The CEO is the only contact who can submit the original submission of the NTD report and is the only contact who can submit reporter requests like extensions and waiver requests. The NTD contact is the validation analyst's main point of contact and can edit, save, and submit all data except for the original submission and any reporter requests. The safety contact is the safety and security analyst's main point of contact. The safety contact can edit, save, and submit all data except for the SNS 20 form, which needs to be completed by the CEO. Editors have the ability to edit and save the data, while viewers have the ability to view data already reported. Each agency is required to have one or more users assigned to the user manager role. The user manager is responsible for creating and managing users, assigning and removing user roles, editing user profile information, and unlocking users. The user manager role can be an additional responsibility for any user in the organization. For example, the entity contact can be both the entity contact as well as the user manager. FTA approval is required to obtain or assign the user manager role to an individual. FTA requires different degrees of reporting based on the type of funding received and the size of the operation. NTD classifies these by reporter type. The different reporter types are full reporter, reduced reporter, also known as small systems waiver. These are small agencies, American Indian tribes, and Alaska Native tribes. You also have separate service reporter, ILD reporter, planning reporter, group plan sponsor, and reduced asset reporter, where you only fill out asset forms, along with the State Department of Transportation, which file a subrecipient report for 5311, 5311F, and 5310 subrecipients. A few of the common reporter types that receive or benefit from 5307 funds are listed here. Full reporters typically operate more than 30 vehicles across all modes and type of service, or operate 30 vehicles or less that operate over fixed guideway and or high-intensity bus segments. Reduced reporters operate fewer than 30 vehicles during peak service and do not operate over fixed guideway or high-intensity busways. Separate service reporters do not operate service directly and contract out modes that are reported by another transit agency. Build reporters do not directly operate or contract out service, but are building or rehabilitating transit infrastructure. Planning reporters also do not directly operate or contract out service, but are currently spending 5307 funding on planning activities for future service. What are the main differences between full reporters and reduced reporters? Full reporters report much more detailed financial data, including a breakdown of expenses by function, including vehicle operations or vehicle maintenance, and object class, including salaries and wages and fringe benefits. Reduced reporters report only their total operating expenses by mode and type of service. Full reporters also report passenger miles traveled, which are used in the federal funding apportionments. Full reporters must report safety and security data on a monthly basis, and full reporters report resource data, which includes maintenance activity and employee counts and employee hours. Requirements to report as a reduced reporter include operating 30 or fewer vehicles in maximum service, and you cannot operate over any fixed guideway. As we mentioned, reduced reporters report less detailed financial, service, and safety data. Reduced reporter agencies also do not have any monthly reporting requirements. We will present the full reporting forms before discussing reduced reporting near the end of this presentation. Now let's cover a few of the important submission dates that you will need to know and remember. If your fiscal year ends sometime between January 1 and June 30th, your annual report will be due on the last business day of October. If your fiscal year ends sometime between July 1st and September 30th, your annual report will be due on the last business day of January. And if your fiscal year ends between October 1st and December 31st, your annual report will be due on the last business day of April. For those of you who are full reporters, you will need to submit your monthly ridership data on the last day of the following month. For example, July's data must be submitted by August 31st. Are you able to only submit some of the required data to the NTD? No. All agencies must provide values for all required fields in the reporting system for the designated reporter type. On special occasions, waivers for certain requirements or reporting elements may be considered by FTA if you are unable to provide that required data. Please note that depending on your reporter type and the modes you operate, you may have different reporting fields and forms than other agencies with different reporter types and services operated. We will now discuss the various annual reporting modules. We'll begin with an overview of the different modules and then dive into the applicable reporting forms that pertain to each module. The NTD collects data on multiple aspects of a transit agency's operations during a month or fiscal year. The data that is collected is organized into several distinct reporting modules based on the type of data reported in each. The 7 reporting modules are as follows: basic, financial, service, asset, resource, federal funding allocation, and declarations. The names of the forms coincide with the first letter of the module name. For example, the forms in the basic module begin with the letter B, and the forms in the financial module begin with the letter F, and so on. The first annual reporting module we will cover is basic module. In the basic module, the NTD collects information regarding transit agencies' organization types, service area characteristics, and contractual relationship details. The B10 identification form is where agencies report basic information on their agency. This includes the organization type of the agency, the urbanized and rural areas they operate within, and the service area populations in square miles. All agencies that report to the NTD complete this form. Agencies that purchase or sell transit service must report the applicable financial and operating data on the contractual relationship B30 form. A B30 form will be filled out for each contractor the agency contracts with, unless the contract details differ between modes. The next annual reporting module we will cover is the financial module. In the financial module, the NTD collects data regarding how much money agencies spend on public transportation during their fiscal year, breaking down the expenses according to what the funds were spent on. Agencies report how much money they spent within each object class and function. They also report where the funding came from. For each dollar spent during the year, agencies must pinpoint how much came from grants, local government funds, fair revenues, donations, or other funding sources. Financial accounting rules are detailed in the Uniform System of Accounts, or the USOA. This is FTA's prescribed accounting system. Now let's cover operating expenses. These are expenses associated with the operation of the transit agency, including goods and services purchased, and are classified by function or activity. For reference, the basic functions and object classes are defined in sections 5.2 and 6.2 of the USOA. Operating expenses are consumable items within a useful life of less than 1 year, or acquisition costs less than the capitalization level established by the government unit for financial statement purposes, or $5,000. Moving on to capital expenses. Capital expenses are related to the purchase of equipment meaning an article of non-expendable tangible personal property, which has a useful life of more than 1 year. Additionally, it must have an acquisition cost which equals or exceeds the lesser of the following: the capitalization level established by the government unit or financial statement purposes, or $5,000. Please note that capital expenses do not include operating expenses that are eligible to use capital funds. We will now cover the reporting forms of the financial module, beginning with the sources of funds F10 form. On the F10 form, agencies report the sources of funds for operating and capital expenses. The funding categories cover sources generated by agencies and from federal, state, and local governments. Agencies report the following data by the original revenue source: the total amount earned, the amount applied for operating expenses, the amount applied for capital expenses. Agencies with building planning, separate service, or full reporting types must complete this form. Next is the uses of capital F20 form. On this form, agencies report the funds expended on capital projects by category. The form further defines capital expenses as an improvement of existing transit service or expansion of transit service. All agencies that purchase capital and report under the build plan, separate service, or full reporting types must complete the F20 form. Moving on to the operating expenses F30 form. On this form, agencies report operating expenses by object class and function as defined by the Uniform System of Accounts. All agencies that operate or purchase transportation service under the plan, separate service, or full reporter types complete the F30 form by mode and type of service. The next form is the operating expense summary F40 form. This form provides an agency-wide summary of the operating expenses from the F30 form or forms. Agencies may report reconciling items on the F40 form, such as depreciation, interest payments, and leases. All agencies that report under the plan, separate service, or full reporter types complete this form. The last form of the financial module is the Statement of Finances F60 form. On this form, agencies report select object classes such as cash and receivables, investments, special funds, long-term debt, estimated long-term pension liabilities, and other estimated liabilities. Agencies with plan, separate service, build, or full reporter types with the 4 organizational types listed below fill out the F60 form. I will now be passing it over to Dan for the remainder of this presentation.
Thank you, Kyle. The next annual reporting module we will cover is the asset module. The asset module is made up of the following forms, which we'll describe going forward. In the asset module, agencies must report a detailed inventory of the assets used to support their transit service. This includes large-scale assets like maintenance facilities or train passenger car fleets, as well as smaller-scale assets like service vehicles or special track work assets. In 2018, agencies began reporting expanded asset inventory module, or AIM data, within their NTD annual report, as required by the Transit Asset Management, or TAM rule. TAM uses transit asset conditions to guide how to manage capital assets and prioritize funding to improve or maintain a state of good repair. The first form we will cover in the asset module is the Stations and Maintenance Facilities A10 form. On the A10 form, agencies report the number of passenger stations, both accessible and non-accessible, in accordance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, the number of elevators and escalators within passenger stations, and the number of maintenance facilities by size and ownership. Continuing with the asset module forms, we will come to the Transit Asset Management Facilities Inventory A15 form. Agencies report inventory data for transit facilities on the A15 form. All passenger stations and parking facilities should be included. Agencies would report a condition assessment for passenger stations for which they have capital responsibility as defined by the TAM rule. Agencies who also report inventory and condition assessments for administrative and maintenance facilities for which they have capital responsibility if the use is greater than incidental. Before moving on to the remainder of the asset module forms, let's take a look at this chart that shows the TAM phase and schedule. For the upcoming 2020 reporting year, agencies are now required to report condition data on at least 3/4 of their facilities, whereas last year, you were only required to report condition data on half of your facilities. Next is the Transitway Mileage A20 form. Agencies that operate over high-intensity busway or fixed guideway provide mileage data on the A20 form, with the exception of ferry services. Moving on to the Revenue Vehicle Inventory A30 form. On this form, agencies inventory revenue vehicles in their total fleet as of the last day of the agency's fiscal year by mode and type of service. All agencies that report service data also report revenue vehicle fleet information by mode and type of service on this form. Next is the Service Vehicle Inventory A35 form, which is where agencies inventory service or support vehicles. Service vehicles are vehicles which indirectly deliver transit service, maintain revenue vehicles, and perform transit-oriented administrative activities. Please note that service vehicles are not to be confused with revenue vehicles, which are used to carry passengers. Examples of reportable service vehicles include vehicles used by administrative or maintenance staff, tow trucks, and work trains. Examples of non-reportable service vehicles include golf carts, small forklifts, and flatbed train cars. The final asset module reporting form is the Transit Asset Management Performance Measure Targets A90 form. Agencies report their next fiscal year performance targets on assets for which they have capital responsibility on this form. Targets are reported for rolling stock, equipment, facilities, and infrastructure. Agencies are required to submit a narrative report on the A90 form, which should report on progress during the year to meet targets set in the previous report year. Their narrative report should also describe any changes to the system, if applicable. You can find examples of narrative reports on FTA's website by visiting the Regulations and Guidance section for asset management. The next annual reporting module is the service module. There's only one form in the service module, the Service S10 form. Agencies that report under the full reporting type complete this form by mode and type of service. In the service module, agencies report detailed information about the service they provide and the passengers consumed. Service data are operating statistics that provide insight into the effectiveness and productivity of a transit agency. This includes the services supplied, such as revenue miles and revenue hours operated by an agency. It also includes services consumed, such as the number of passengers taken and the total passenger miles traveled. An agency reporter type determines the level of detail that they must report. Revenue service is when a transit vehicle providing public transportation is available to carry passengers. Revenue service is measured through revenue hours and revenue miles and consists of two elements. First is running time, which is the time it takes your transit agency vehicle to travel from the beginning to the end of the transit route. And the second is layover and recovery time, which is the scheduled time at the end of each trip to provide the transit operator a break or an opportunity to get the transit service back on schedule if it was running late. Deadhead service is the miles and hours that a vehicle travels when out of revenue service. This is typically when a vehicle is leaving or returning to the garage or yard facility, changing routes, or when there is no expectation of carrying revenue passengers. One thing to note when calculating revenue service is for a demand response service is that after passengers dropped off, the driver is heading directly to pick up another passenger. That time and distance to pick up the next passenger is considered revenue service, even though there's no passenger on board. Also, typically in a demand response service, the vehicle is only deadheading when the vehicle leaves the yard and heads to the first pickup, and then during the travel back to the yard after the last drop-off. The services consumed section of the S10 form measures the use of public transportation. NTD data collects on two measures. First are only passenger trips. Passengers are counted each time they board vehicles, no matter how many vehicles they use to travel from their origin to their destination. Multiple transfers mean multiple trips. However, if a transit vehicle changes routes while passengers are on board or interlining, the passengers should not be counted. Please note, not be recounted. Please note that the employees or contractors on transit agency business are not considered passengers. However, for demand response modes, personal care attendants and companions should be counted. The second measure of the service consumed section are passenger miles traveled. Passenger miles traveled is a cumulative sum of distance ridden by each passenger. For example, if there are 10 passengers that get on the bus at stop A and proceed to travel 2 miles to stop B, you would calculate 20 passenger miles traveled for this part of the trip. Passenger miles traveled are only required for agencies with full reporter types. There are two ways to collect passenger miles traveled: automatic passenger counters or sampling. APCs are an automated means of counting boarding and alighting passengers. These are typically infrared beams placed by the doors. If your buses are not equipped with APCs, you would then need to sample to collect passenger miles traveled. Agencies can choose to use the NTD sampling method or have a qualified statistician approve a different method. Please note, another passenger miles traveled collection method is the use of driver logs or manifests, which are common for paratransit services. The next annual reporting module we will cover is the resource module. In the resource module, full reporters report the labor resources they have available for the year, including the number of employees they had during the year, as well as the number of hours worked. This allows data users to understand the labor resources each transit agency utilizes to operate their systems on an annual basis. Agencies also report the number of mechanical breakdowns and failures their vehicles experience each year. Any mechanical incident which prevents a transit vehicle from working at its optimal performance would be reported, regardless of whether the vehicle completes its trip or has to return to the garage. The first resource module form is the employee's R10 form. On the R10 form, agencies report data on transit employees at year-end and total hours worked during the year. Agencies that report directly operated service under full reporting type fill out the R10 form by mode. The next and final resource module form is the maintenance performance R20 form. Agencies report data on revenue vehicle system failures on this form. The two types of failures that are reported are major mechanical system failures and other mechanical system failures. Major mechanical system failures are failures of some mechanical element of the revenue vehicle and includes vehicles that were prevented from completing or starting a scheduled revenue trip due to limited movement or safety concerns caused by the failure. Other mechanical system failures are failures of some other mechanical element of the revenue vehicle and, due to agency policy, prevents the vehicle from completing a scheduled trip or from starting the next scheduled trip, even though the vehicle is physically able to continue in revenue service. System failures that were the result of a collision, natural disaster, or vandalism would not be reported as a major or other mechanical system failure. All agencies that report under the full reporting type must complete the R20 form, separating data out by mode and type of service. We will now discuss the federal funding allocation module. In the federal funding allocation statistics module, agencies allocate data across the urbanized areas and non-urbanized areas they serve on the FFA-10 form. FTA uses the FFA-10 form to apportion funds for sections 5307, 5311, 5329, 5337, and 5339. All agencies that report urban service data fill out the FFA-10 forms by mode and type of service. We will now discuss the declarations form. In the declarations module, the CEO endorses and attests to the accuracy of the data submitted in the NTD annual report on the CEO certification D10 form. All full and reduced reporters must complete this form. On this form, the CEO also certifies the completion of an independent auditor statement. These statements assure FTA that an independent entity has compared NTD data to internal agency records describing any discrepancies found. There are two types of independent auditor statements: the independent auditor statement for financial data, or the IAS-FD, and the independent auditor statement for federal funding allocation data, or IAS-FFA. The IAS-FD is required in the first year and every 10 years thereafter for all urban transit operators. The IAS-FFA is required every year for agencies operating in large urban areas with more than 100 vehicles operated in maximum service. Now that we have covered the annual reporting module, let's discuss the monthly reporting module and the associated MR20 form. Agencies filing a full report provide monthly data on the ridership activity MR20 form, which is due on the last day of the following month. For example, June monthly ridership data will be due on the last day of July. The following data points are reported on the MR20: unlinked passenger trips, vehicle revenue miles, vehicle revenue hours, and vehicles operated during maximum service. Agencies will complete an MR20 form for each of their modes. Next, we'll move on to the safety and security reporting module and the associated forms. First is the security configuration SNS30 form. This form is used to collect information on the number and type of police and/or security personnel at a transit agency. The SNS 30 form is completed annually at the beginning of the calendar year. Next, we have the Major Event Report SNS 40 form. The SNS 40 is designed to capture detailed information on the most severe safety and security incidents occurring in the transit environment. This form reports detailed data, typically gathered from sources such as accident, incident, or police reports. This form is completed for each major incident that occurs, such as collisions, fires, and derailments at an agency. The information required on this form is intended to be at a level that can be collected within 30 days of the event occurrence. Then there is the Summary Security Reporting SNS 50 form. The SNS 50 is designed to collect information on less severe safety-related incidents that are gathered on the Major Event Report SNS 40 form. The SNS 50 summarizes per mode and per month the number of safety events such as single injury slips and falls or non-major fires that have occurred, and the number of injuries that have occurred in a fixed number of categories. Lastly, there is a Safety and Security CEO Certification SNS 20 form. This form is a letter approved by the transit agency CEO that certifies and attests to safety and security data submitted in the previous year's reports. We'll now go over the forms and reporting requirements for which are specific to reduced reporting agencies. Agencies with fewer than 30 vehicles operating maximum service may elect to report a reduced amount of service, financial, and safety data on the Reduced Reporting RR20 form. The RR20 form captures total modal expenses, uses of capital, and sources of funds for transit operations and capital by funding category. Total modal expenses and service data are reported separately by mode and type of service. Additionally, the RR20 form captures services supplied, such as revenue hours, revenue miles, and also captures services consumed, such as unlinked passenger trips. Additionally, safety and security event totals, injuries, and fatalities are also reported on this form. The RR20 form is only filled out by reduced reporter reporting types, also known as small system waiver reporters. This is a list of all the forms required by reduced reporting agencies. The one form that is unique to reduced reporters is the RR20 form, which I just discussed. Finally, we'll move on to the last module for the reporting resources. Before we wrap up our presentation and open up for questions, let's cover the resources available for NTD reporting. The first resource is the NTD Help Desk phone and email, which serves several purposes, including providing technical assistance for NTD reporters with questions about reporting, applying for an NTD, or applying for an ID, reporting unexpected system behavior, etc. The NTD Help Desk also provides a line for general public data users who wish to better understand how to navigate NTD's data publications. So if you are unable to get a hold of your validation analyst, please contact the NTD Help Desk for technical assistance. Another resource for NTD reporting is your NTD analyst. An NTD analyst or validation analyst is assigned to every transit agency who reports to the National Transit Database. These analysts are liaisons to FTA who maintain regular contact with the agency throughout the report year to assist with completing the NTD report and understanding NTD policy. Generally speaking, agencies who currently report to the NTD should always contact their analyst with agency-specific questions. Here are the several online resources available to NTD reporting, including the NTD Reporting Policy Manual, the Reduced Reporting Policy Manual, the Asset Inventory Module Reporting Guide, the Uniform System of Accounts, and the NTD Sampling Manual. Additionally, here are the links to the NTD publications, which includes agency profiles and data reports. We have now reached the end of our presentation. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, please submit them using the Q&A button.
Thanks. I just want to pop on for 1 second and apologize again about the mix-up with the links. I'm working remotely from home, and I had an old version saved on my work computer that I dial into and a different version saved here, and they got mixed up, and I sent out the previous non-updated version. So I apologize. I have pasted the updated links in the chat box. Just scroll around. They're in there a couple of times, so you can download them. I apologize. I know it's hard to follow along when what you're seeing doesn't always reflect what's on the screen. That said, we have one open question. Someone said the reporting link doesn't work. Does anyone know anything about that?
Hey, Claude, I'll answer that question. I believe that the link may not work in the presentation because maybe it's last year's link. We just updated the policy manuals and all the other manuals for 2020 in the past couple of days, so that might be an old link. But if you go to the website, fta.transit.dot.gov/NTD, you'll be able to see all the updated manuals and links there that you can use.
Great, thanks. Someone missed Tuesdays. Tuesdays was the important clarifications. I don't think that's on the schedule for a second time, but we recorded it, and I can post that link if you give me 1 second to click around. That was for Sean Irvin. Terry Kuhn asks, can we get a link to the presentation? Yes, I'm going to talk to our coordinator who's going to send that out. I'm going to include the link to the survey, so please take that. The link to the actual corrected handouts, and also a link to the Q&A box in case anyone wants that. Hopefully I'll get the video up on the YouTube page in a couple of days, maybe by early next week. Does anybody have any other questions? Oh, dead air makes me nervous, so.
I think Brooke had a question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so the annual forms have not yet been populated for the 2020 fiscal year. Generally, they get populated sometime in September, date to be determined. But they won't show up for another couple months, a month, I guess month at this point, month and a half.
Okay. I'm glad everyone thought this was helpful and informative. That's great. John Bailey wants to know about the Q&A. I'm going to send a link to that in the survey email, which will go out again later this afternoon or tomorrow morning. I feel like I was getting the bulk of the questions today. Kind of my fault. Any other questions? We do have more time. Question came in about 2-day in-person training. I think that's a question for NTI because we do have a 2-day NTI class, NTD course. We're actually in the process of, we're going to pilot that. It's difficult to sit on Zoom for that many hours, so we're breaking it up, I think actually over 4 days instead of 2 days in person. Hopefully we'll be having a bunch of those in the very near future. So keep checking our website, sign up for our mailing list. There's a link on there. Oh boy, the questions are coming in. Okay, so that was for S. Coit, I guess. So keep checking. We're working on it. It will be soon. We're going to have a bunch of those. Okay, a question for the NTD guys. It's hard enough to collect DTA from all my state's rural reporters and enter it into NTD by the end of October without the forms for the year not being available until mid-September. It's more of a comment, but anyone want to?
Yeah, I mean, if you have, I guess, concerns about that, I would have you reach out to the NTD help desk and I guess maybe launch a formal complaint. The reason that the forms don't get launched until so late is because the summer is when we do a bulk of our system changes. We have to wait for policy clarifications to be made. And so it's not optimal, I guess, to only give you a month and a half before the reporting deadline, but it's just trying to crunch everything in to get the reporting system ready for the next year.
Okay, I'll flip that. So there's 2 COVID related questions. Is there further training for the COVID reporting document, and will schedule modifications due to COVID create validation issues?
I think probably the webinar on Tuesday was a good resource, but you can also go to, I believe it is the NTD website. If you go under manuals, there is a manual related specifically to guidance for COVID-19. So that's transit.dot.gov/NTD/manuals. And under annual reporting policy, there's a guide for COVID-19 and NTD reporting. And I guess as far as the validation issues, I don't know that I have an answer for that one. I don't think that we're changing the constraints of validation issues to reflect COVID-19 because that would just involve a lot of guesswork. So I don't think there's going to be any changes. There'll just be, unfortunately, I think a lot of issues related to COVID-19.
Okay. I also did just want to interject. Someone, the Tuesday webinar came up. If anyone wants to go to our YouTube page, it's youtube.com/user/Rutgers-NTI. That one is on there, and many years back worth of recorded webinars are on there. I'm pasting that in the chat box right now. Where was I? Okay, wait, we answered the COVID question. For reduced reporters, is it always the case that the agency submit the data directly because of the need for CEO certification, or do state DOTs sometimes submit on their behalf? Anyone?
So for reduced reporters, if you're not a subrecipient, so no, I guess reduced reporters almost always file their own NTD report, I guess, unless they're underneath the state DOT umbrella, in which case they're reporting information to the state. The state is entering in that information in a form that looks very much like the reduced reporting form, and then they're reporting it. And if can I jump back, I guess, to the validation issue question about COVID? We are making changes apparently to the validation in an attempt to reduce and modify the validation that an agency would get. So obviously we know that COVID-19 is going to affect how people report, the data they report, and it looks like we've made or are making changes to the validation so that people won't be swamped with issues.
Oh, more questions coming in. So if we are sponsoring the subsidy from federal money, we do have to report it, correct? It is operated by enterprise.
Yeah, so if they're the public sponsoring agency, they would report, they're reporting the service themselves, and they would report any of the subsidy money that they are, I guess, either receiving from the federal government and then paying forth to the contractor or enterprise. That would ensure that they're reporting the full cost of service.
Okay. This is an anonymous attendee. I have commented previously over multiple years about the short turnaround due to the late publication of forms. I think we touched on this already. And you had said to file a formal complaint, I think. It says reporters with 6/30 fiscal year end used to have until 11/30 to get data into the system. The 10/31 date for NTD reporting is at the same time as FFR reporting and annual milestone updates. I'm tasked with doing all three things for our state. Yikes.
Yeah, so that's not great. But I think that goes along with what I said before. I think maybe filing a complaint or talking to the NTD program office. If you want, you can submit a complaint through the NTD help desk, and we'll forward that along, and someone can reach out to you and maybe address that concern more specifically.
Great. Claude asks, isn't the state always the pass-through entity for federal funds received by rural agencies?
I don't know if that's always the case. I think that's generally the case. And if it's a reporting question about how you report those funds, I guess if you're a rural agency, you're being reported by the state anyway. So the state is filing their own entity report and you're kind of under that umbrella. If you're a reduced reporter who operates in a rural area, you're getting that money from the state, but you would report it as if it came from the federal government because you're reporting revenue sources by the original source.
Related-ish question. The report is due 10/31, but CAFR is due until 12/31. What happens if the auditors have an adjustment to the transit financial data? Do I revise the report?
Yeah, the CAFR. So if the audit and your CAFR are not done by the time the entity is submitted, and then the auditors go through and they say, we need you to make this change, almost always you're able to go back into the report and make a revision to the financial data to accurately reflect what's in the CAFR. I would just let your validation analyst know that you need to make a change because of this.
Okay. Someone also wants to know, what about a reduced reporter in an urbanized area? How do they report their data?
So I think that's kind of a general question, but basically if you already have an NTD ID number, you would just go in, you'd basically have, you have your NTD report with all the forms on there. You would just fill out those forms, address the validation issues, and then submit the NTD report. If there's a specific question related to, the reduced reporter, or if this is their first time doing it, they log into the reporting system and they go to their report. They can view their validation analyst and let them know that they're new and maybe have some questions. And your validation analyst should be more than happy to go through and just kind of, I guess, get you set up in the system and get you familiar.
Any other questions? Keep them coming. There was a question in the Q&A box from Minna Lee. It wasn't in the Q&A box, sorry. It was in the chat box. It said, what's the difference between revenue service miles/hours and vehicle service miles/hours?
So I think what they're asking is, what is revenue service versus what is the total? If you're on the S10 form, there's actual miles and then there's vehicle revenue miles. Actual miles are revenue miles and deadhead miles, and then vehicle revenue miles are just the amount of revenue service you're providing. So there's a couple good exhibits in the entity policy manual that talk about this sort of thing. Basically, if you're in the garage or your dispatch location, the vehicle leaves, it's incurring deadhead miles. That's a part of actual miles or hours. Then it makes its first stop. It picks somebody up. Now it's in revenue service. So I guess that's the distinction, is that revenue service is when you're actually either carrying passengers or would be carrying passengers if there was someone at a stop to pick up, versus actual is both the deadheading from the dispatch location to the first pickup as well as the revenue service.
Thanks. There's no more open questions. We can wait a few minutes, seconds. Oh, last question for Claude. How do you measure directional route miles? Can you clarify?
Okay, so directional route miles is the sum of all the routes that you operate without double counting, I guess, areas where the routes operate over the same roadway. So I think someone who's from the north might use the example of like, if there was a foot of snow on the ground and then you operated all your routes over the roadways and you just measured the amount of tracks in the snow, that would be your directional route miles. I guess another way to explain would be is if you had, let's say your whole system was 2 1-mile routes and then half of each route overlapped. So I gotta figure out the math on that one. I think you're, yeah, I wish I had my notepad here. So 0.5 miles are overlapping. Each mile is a route, or each route is a mile. It's not a good example, is it? Basically, you just don't want to double count the miles. If you have a transit way or a length of segment that is operated over many routes, you only count that length of roadway a single time. Maybe that's a better way of explaining it.
Yeah, I think what Kyle's trying to say is if you have 4 or 5 routes that go down, for example, Main Street for 5 miles, and then they go north and south down Main Street, you only want to count those 5 miles north and south one time. You don't count it 4 or 5 times, depending on how many times you physically travel over that portion of roadway.
And I guess in my example, the directional route miles would be 1.5 miles.
Okay. Anyone else? I don't want to cut anyone off if they're typing furiously, but the questions seem to have dwindled. So
I guess while we wait for maybe a couple of the responses, I'll just reiterate that if someone has a complaint or about either the timeline or an NTD reporting policy, that they should probably contact their NTD analyst. The analyst will then forward that concern or complaint onto the FTA program management team, who will ultimately reach back out to you.
okay. Well, Allison wants to know when we will be assigned the analyst.
Okay, so if you already have an NTD reporting ID and you log into your reporting system, at the top of the page where your NTD report is, it'll say, your reporter name, your deadline, your due date, and then it should also list who your assigned analyst is. If you're not sure who your assigned analyst is, you can call the NTD help desk and say, I don't know who to contact, I don't know how to get in the system, and they should be able to help you out and just point you in the right direction, give you the right contact information.
Oh, they're coming back in now. Pete Binion, are the standard NTD reporting deadlines being adjusted by COVID?
The answer is no. So the standard NTD reporting deadlines are still in place. And if there's a situation where, for whatever reason related to COVID, that you need more time to complete your NTD report, they would just need to fill out an extension request in the reporting system.
Great. This one's from Tracy. Regarding passenger miles for use in apportioning 5311, how does that relate to actual 5311 service if, I guess, urbanized full reporters report that statistic? If only, I guess that's supposed to be only urbanized full reporters report that statistic.
Passenger miles traveled are not used for 5311 apportionment. Only vehicle revenue miles.
Okay. Looks Looks like that's it. I guess we'll wrap it up. There's no more questions. Okay, that's it. Going once, going twice. Done. Tracy under the wire. That's not what the slide deck or the audio said about 5311. Also, where can I see VRM for 5311?
So I think there's maybe a question or a distinction between like the apportionment and how you report NTD data. If you're an urbanized area and you report, if you're an urban agency that operates in a rural area, you have to allocate your service between the urbanized area and the rural area. But I think as far as the 5311 apportionment goes, it's passenger miles traveled aren't, I guess, a part of that. So I'd have to look back at the presentation and see if we made a mistake somewhere. As far as the VRM for 5311 funding, you know, if you're reporting in the reporting system, you can go into what would be the federal funding allocation form, and you can see how agencies have allocated. I think maybe I'm just not understanding the question.
Tracy, do you want to clarify either in the Q&A box or I'm watching the chat box too? You can get up. For the 5311 VRM, I'm interested in seeing national. Okay. Oh, you got it? National rural. So okay.
I think what they want to do probably, they're trying to get an idea of like well, basically what you want to do is go to the NTD data forms. So if you go to the NTD website, transit.dot.gov, and you go to, let's see here, NTD data is what it would be under, and you go to NTD data reports. This is where we publish all the annual data products from the data that we collect. And you can go through and there's a rural file, and you can look at the amount of vehicle revenue miles under each state or each urbanized area and I guess non-urbanized area for the rural.
Yeah, it should be called the UZA sums file. UZA sums is what you should be looking for there. That should have all the information you need.
Okay. Any more questions? Guess not. So I'm going to wrap it up. I want to thank everyone for participating. Thank you to Kyle and Dan. Great presentation, a lot of good feedback. And speaking of feedback, we would like you to fill out a survey which will be sent to you very soon, an evaluation. I will also, to tempt you to open it, include the links for the handouts, the link to the Q&A text box, and heck, I'll put the YouTube page link in there too, so you can wait for this to get posted if you want to rewatch it. We really appreciate your feedback. I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you so much. Everyone be well, be safe, and it's almost the weekend. Take care.